Inside ADX Florence, America's most secure prison. There is a prison in the United States where silence is used as a weapon. Where men are locked alone for years, sometimes decades, without ever touching another human being. A place designed not to rehabilitate, not to punish, but to remove people from the world entirely. This is ADX Florence. And once you enter, the system is built to make sure you never leave the same person. A prison designed to disappear people. ADX Florence sits in Fremont County, Colorado, surrounded by open land and distant mountains. From the outside, it looks sterile, almost quiet, more like a research facility than a prison. That's intentional. This facility was never meant to look intimidating. It was meant to be final. The official name is the United States Penitentiary Administrative Maximum Facility. Administrative Maximum. The words sound clinical, bureaucratic. But among inmates, guards, and federal officials, it's known by a simpler name, the Supermax. ADX Florence was built in the early 1990s after a series of violent incidents inside the federal prison system. Inmates who could not be controlled anywhere else, those who attacked staff, organized murders, or continued criminal operations from behind bars, were placed beyond the reach of traditional prisons. What happens next is where ADX separates itself from everything else in America. This prison is not about bars and gangs and yard politics. It's about isolation, engineered, measured, and enforced every minute of every day. And to understand how it works, you have to start with the cell. The cell, a world measuring 87 square feet. An ADX cell is roughly 7 by 12 feet. Concrete walls. Concrete floor. Concrete ceiling. There is no decoration. No exposed metal bars. No view of the horizon. The bed is molded concrete with a thin mattress. The desk is concrete. The stool is concrete. The sink and toilet are stainless steel, fused into one unit. And then there's the window. It's about 4 inches wide. Positioned high. Angled so the inmate can see only sky, no mountains, no buildings, no people. This design is deliberate. It prevents prisoners from tracking the sun's movement, from understanding time, from feeling connected to the outside world. For most inmates here, this cell is where they will spend at least 22 hours a day. Sometimes more. Meals are passed through a slot in the door. Human contact is minimal. Conversations, if they happen at all, are shouted through concrete. This is not temporary confinement. For many prisoners, this is life. And the psychological effects begin faster than most people expect. Who gets sent here? ADX Florence houses some of the most notorious criminals in modern American history: domestic terrorists, international extremists, cartel leaders, organized crime bosses, serial killers. But notoriety alone isn't what lands someone here. ADX is reserved for inmates deemed impossible to manage elsewhere. Those who kill inside prison. Those who organize violence across institutions. Those who continue commanding criminal networks from behind bars. For federal officials, ADX is a solution to a specific problem. What do you do with someone who remains dangerous even when incarcerated? The answer was extreme isolation. But the question remains, what does that isolation do to a human mind? Former wardens have described ADX as clean and orderly. Former inmates have used very different words. And what happens after placement here is where the system reveals its true cost. Daily life on the inside. Every day at ADX Florence follows the same rigid structure. Inmates wake up alone. Eat alone. Sit alone. Sleep alone. Breakfast arrives through the slot. So does lunch. So does dinner. The food is nutritionally sufficient but intentionally plain. There are no communal meals. No diningols. No conversations across tables. Showering is limited, scheduled, and monitored. Recreation, when permitted, takes place in what inmates call dog runs, small concrete enclosures with high walls and metal grating above. Some prisoners exercise alone. Others don't exercise at all. Motivation erodes quickly when every day feels identical to the last. Mail is heavily screened. Phone calls are rare and monitored. Visits, when allowed, take place behind thick glass with phones that sometimes barely work. And here's the detail most people don't realize: silence is constant. No radios. No televisions for many inmates. No background noise except the hum of ventilation and the distant echo of doors. For some prisoners, weeks pass without hearing another human voice speak directly to them. What happens to the mind in that environment is something even the designers couldn't fully predict. Isolation as control. ADX Florence operates on total control. Every movement is regulated. Every interaction is documented. Cells are monitored around the clock. Guards communicate through reinforced doors. Inmates are moved using strict procedures designed to prevent any physical contact. When prisoners leave their cells, they are often restrained with handcuffs, waist chains, and leg irons, even if they're just going to shower. This level of control isn't about punishment. It's about prevention. Violence inside ADX is rare. Assaults are uncommon. Murders are almost non-existent. But that doesn't mean the environment is safe. Because while physical violence is limited, psychological pressure never stops. And that pressure builds slowly. The mental cost. Former inmates have described symptoms that began within months: insomnia, paranoia, hallucinations. Some reported hearing voices. Others lost the ability to concentrate or remember basic details. Without human interaction, the brain starts to turn inward. Small sensations become overwhelming. Sounds feel amplified. Thoughts loop endlessly with no interruption. Psychologists have compared prolonged solitary confinement to sensory deprivation experiments. The difference is that here, there's no end date. Some inmates deteriorated to the point of self-harm. Others stopped speaking entirely. And that raises a question that still divides experts today: at what point does control become damage? That question becomes even more complicated when we look at how inmates are supposed to leave ADX. The step-down program. ADX Florence is often described as permanent, but officially, it's not meant to be. The Bureau of Prisons operates a step-down program designed to slowly reintroduce inmates to social interaction. In theory, good behavior leads to slightly less restrictive housing, more out-of-cell time, limited group activities. Eventually, transfer to another facility. In reality, progression is slow, sometimes painfully slow. Inmates must demonstrate compliance for years. Any infraction, no matter how minor, can reset progress. For prisoners already struggling mentally, this system can feel unreachable. And for some, the step-down never comes at all. Which brings us to the people who are likely to die here. Forever inmates. Some men at ADX Florence have no release date. Others are serving multiple life sentences. A few are held under special administrative measures that restrict communication even further. For these inmates, time is not a countdown. It's an open-ended void. The prison doesn't tell them how long they'll stay. Appeals move slowly. Reviews are opaque. The uncertainty itself becomes part of the punishment. And yet, the system continues to operate largely out of public view. Few journalists have been inside. Even fewer cameras. Which leads to the question most people never ask: if a place is designed to be invisible, how do we measure what it does? That question becomes unavoidable when we examine the lawsuits, the investigations, and the criticism. Controversy and criticism. Human rights organizations have long criticized ADX Florence. Lawsuits have argued that prolonged isolation violates constitutional protections against cruel and unusual punishment. Some federal judges have raised concerns about mentally ill inmates being housed here. Reports have documented cases where prisoners deteriorated severely before receiving treatment. The Bureau of Prisons maintains that ADX is necessary. That it protects staff, inmates, and the public. That alternatives simply don't exist for individuals this dangerous. Both sides point to data. Both sides claim the moral high ground. But data doesn't capture experience. And experience is where the story becomes most unsettling. Why ADX still exists. ADX Florence remains open because, in the eyes of federal authorities, it works. There are no riots here. No gang wars. No hostage situations. Control is absolute. But control comes at a price, and that price is paid quietly, one isolated cell at a time. As the prison system evolves, ADX stands as both a solution and a warning. A place that proves humans can be controlled almost completely. And a place that forces us to ask whether control alone should ever be the goal. ADX Florence was built to contain the uncontainable. To silence the most dangerous voices. To eliminate risk. But silence has consequences. And the question that lingers isn't whether ADX works. It's what it costs, and who decides that price. Because somewhere behind those concrete walls, time keeps moving. And for some men inside, it may never mean freedom again. Communication without voices. In a place built on silence, communication doesn't disappear. It adapts. Inside ADX Florence, inmates have developed ways to remind themselves they are not alone, even when the system is designed to convince them otherwise. Some tap codes through walls. Others listen carefully for footsteps, timing movements just to hear another door open. A cough becomes a signal. A scrape of concrete becomes a greeting. These are not conversations in the normal sense. They're fragments, proof of life. Proof that another human mind still exists nearby. Officials know this happens. They monitor it. Sometimes they stop it. But eliminating every sound, every signal, is impossible. And that small fact reveals something important. Even here, isolation is never absolute. It only feels that way. What happens when that fragile connection is taken away is where things start to unravel. Discipline inside the Supermax. Rule violations at ADX Florence don't look like they do in other prisons. There are no fights in the yard. No open defiance. Everything is quieter and more severe. Punishments often mean further restriction. Recreation time reduced. Property removed. Communication limited even more. In extreme cases, inmates can be placed on what's effectively total isolation, with lights on longer, movement reduced to near zero. The logic is simple: when someone already has almost nothing, taking away what little remains is a powerful tool. For inmates already on the edge psychologically, this can push them further. And once that line is crossed, recovery becomes uncertain. Mental health and the system's limits. ADX Florence was not built as a mental health facility. Yet over the years, it has housed inmates whose psychological conditions worsened dramatically inside its walls. The Bureau of Prisons has acknowledged this tension. Specialized units exist. Evaluations are conducted. Treatment is provided, on paper. But treatment inside extreme isolation has limits. Therapy through a door. Medication through a slot. Observation through glass. Critics argue that no amount of clinical procedure can counteract years of near-total solitude. Supporters counter that the individuals housed here leave no other option. Both sides are responding to the same reality: some minds break under pressure, and ADX applies pressure continuously. What happens when a mind breaks in a place designed for control is rarely visible to the outside world. And that invisibility is part of the design. The view from the staff side. To understand ADX fully, you also have to look at it from the other side of the door. Correctional officers here operate in one of the most controlled environments in American corrections. They rarely touch inmates. Procedures are rigid. Movement is choreographed. For staff, this reduces risk, but it creates distance. Some officers describe the work as emotionally draining. Others describe it as efficient and professional. They don't see themselves as enforcers of suffering. They see themselves as managers of risk. And yet, even with layers of procedure, the psychological weight of the place affects everyone inside, not just the prisoners. Because working in silence changes perception. It changes how time feels. It changes how normal life looks when the shift ends. This isn't just a prison. It's a closed system. And closed systems always shape the people inside them. The myth of worst of the worst ADX Florence is often described as housing the worst of the worst. The phrase is common. It's simple. And it's incomplete. Some inmates here committed horrific crimes. Others committed serious crimes inside prison. But a number arrived after long chains of disciplinary decisions, transfers stacked on transfers, until ADX became the final stop. Over time, the population has changed. The facility now holds fewer inmates than it once did. Policies have shifted. Reviews are more frequent. But the label remains. And labels matter, because they shape how much scrutiny a place receives. When a prison is believed to contain only monsters, few people ask what happens inside. That silence outside mirrors the silence within. Leaving ADX. For the small number of inmates who do leave ADX Florence, the transition is often jarring. After years of isolation, ordinary prisons feel overwhelming. Noise. Movement. Human proximity. Some former inmates struggle to function in general population. Others never fully adjust. The habits learned in isolation, withdrawal, hypervigilance, emotional suppression, don't disappear easily. And this raises a final uncomfortable question: if the goal of incarceration includes eventual reintegration, what happens when a system makes reintegration nearly impossible? ADX doesn't answer that question. It avoids it. ADX Florence exists because society demanded certainty. Absolute security. Zero tolerance for risk. ADX Florence exists because society demanded certainty. Absolute security. Zero tolerance for risk. And in that sense, it succeeds. But it also reflects something deeper: our willingness to trade human connection for control when fear feels overwhelming. This prison is not an accident of policy. It is a deliberate choice, built from concrete and procedure, reinforced by public approval that rarely asks for details. Inside ADX, there is no chaos. No spectacle. No drama that spills into headlines. There is only routine. And routine, when combined with isolation, becomes something else entirely. Because time does not pass normally here. It accumulates. And the longer it accumulates, the more it reshapes the people inside. Time without landmarks. In most prisons, inmates measure time through events, meals, counts, work assignments, yard movement. At ADX Florence, those landmarks fade. Days blur together. Without social interaction, memory weakens. Prisoners report forgetting dates, seasons, even years. Some mark time by scratching walls. Others stop trying altogether. When every day is identical, the future becomes abstract. This is not boredom. It's erosion. And once time loses meaning, hope often follows. That's when the system becomes most dangerous, not because inmates are violent, but because they stop responding. Resistance in small forms. Resistance at ADX Florence is quiet. It doesn't look like riots or strikes. It looks like refusing meals, filing grievances, writing letters that may never be answered. Some inmates read obsessively, clinging to books as a way to escape the walls. Others maintained strict routines, exercise, pacing, mental repetition, to preserve a sense of control. These acts are small. But in an environment designed to strip autonomy, they matter. They are reminders that the system, no matter how rigid, does not fully erase agency. Still, resistance has limits here. And when it fails, the consequences are rarely immediate, but they are lasting. When silence breaks. Occasionally, silence at ADX Florence is interrupted. A medical emergency. A psychological collapse. A rare act of self-harm. These moments are handled quickly. Clinically. With as little disruption as possible. The goal is always the same: restore order. What happens afterward is harder to see. Inmates involved are often further restricted. Observation increases. Movement decreases. The system tightens. And once tightened, it rarely loosens again. The public distance. Most Americans will never see the inside of ADX Florence. They won't hear its silence or feel its stillness. Public awareness comes in fragments, lawsuits, documentaries, brief news coverage. Then attention shifts elsewhere. This distance is critical to ADX's existence. Because places like this rely on being out of sight. Not hidden, but accepted. As long as the people inside are perceived as beyond empathy, the system remains unquestioned. And that may be the most powerful structure of all. Does it end? There is no dramatic ending at ADX Florence. No final confrontation. No release sequence for most inmates. The prison does not resolve stories. It suspends them. Years pass. Reviews occur. Paperwork moves. Cells remain occupied. And the silence continues. ADX Florence was built to answer a question: how do you contain people who cannot be controlled? It answered with isolation. But in doing so, it created another question, one that has no easy solution. How much isolation is too much? How much control becomes damage? And what responsibility remains when punishment succeeds too well? Behind these walls, time moves slowly. Minds change quietly. Lives unfold without witnesses. And long after the doors close each night, the silence stays. Because some prisons aren't meant to be loud. They're meant to disappear. Silence was the weapon here. Not bars. Not walls. Just time, isolation, and control. ADX Florence doesn't rely on chaos to break men. It relies on patience. And the question it leaves behind isn't whether it works. It's what it turns people into. Somewhere behind those concrete walls, another day just ended. Exactly like the one before it.